Welcome to the 2016 Iowa City Book Festival. You've probably all been at many other events, so welcome to this 2016 Iowa City Book Festival reading, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank our sponsors who made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, Sheraton Iowa City, the Iowa City Public Library, yay. I work at the Iowa City Public Library, the Iowa City Corvallis Convention and Visitors Bureau, and Iowa Tourism. Today we will hear from author Claire Hoffman. Claire Hoffman works as a magazine writer living in Los Angeles, writing for national magazines covering culture, religion, celebrity, business, and whatever else seems interesting. Hoffman's memoir, Greetings from Utopia Park, Surviving a Transcendent Childhood, is set in Fairfield, Iowa. Please help me welcome Claire Hoffman.
Thank you, Maeve. Okay, can you guys hear me if I stand up straight? Yeah, okay, great. Don't have to lean over. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. This is my birth city, so it's exciting to be back. Just out of curiosity, I have a little slideshow that I've given before, but I'm curious how many people are familiar with Fairfield just before I start. Okay, which is not my usual audience. So we can have like a call and response if you feel like I get anything wrong. Let me know. I'm totally open. It's an open source lecture. So what I thought I would do is give you a little background for those of you who haven't read the book, or if there's parts you're not familiar with of my story, and then I was going to read just a little section of the book and then just open it up to questions. I like questions better than talking about myself. So I wrote this memoir. It came out in June, and it is the story of my story of growing up in Fairfield and the Transcendental Meditation movement. And so the book begins, let's see, with a man named Mahesh Varma. And Mahesh Varma lived in India, and he was born in the early part of the 20th century, and he was born to a clerical family. His father was an administrator, and their ambition was to send their son to college. And Mahesh was a good student, and he enjoyed science and mathematics. And he didn't really have any kind of spiritual life to speak of until one day he went with his friends to a local ashram to see the Shankaracharya, who has a super long name that I will butcher, so I'm not going to say it, but was known locally as Guru Dev. And the moment that Mahesh saw him, he would later recount, was this incredibly powerful moment. You know, he sort of had this transformational experience where he wanted to leave his life behind and just spend his time with Guru Dev, dedicate himself to his service. And ultimately, that's what he ended up doing. He finished college and he came back and he worked as a secretary for Guru Dev for over a decade. And Mahesh was, you know, he was from this sort of administrative family. He wasn't from a spiritual family, but he had so much love and adoration for Guru Dev and his teachings. And when he died, the sort of lure goes that he was heartbroken, and he went and lived in a cave for a number of years and meditated. And when he emerged with this huge ambition to teach the world this technique, this meditation technique that he had learned from this great sage. And his sort of revolutionary idea was to take meditation, out of the ashram, out of the caves, and make it something that the local, what they called the householder class could practice. It was something that could coexist with daily life. And meanwhile, let's see, where that took him, which I feel like many people here know, is he ended up coming to the United States. He traveled around India, and then he came to the United States, and his message really connected with a generation of young people. And so he sort of became best known for being the guru to the Beatles, and they visited him in Rishikesh. And he was, from the beginning, really good at getting his message out to the media. You know, he was very savvy about that and very savvy about connecting with famous people and wealthy people. And as you can see, you know, by the late 60s and 1970s, he was just this iconic figure. You know, he was sort of the guru when it came to gurus. And he was written about everywhere, and meditation was something that everyone was doing. And, you know, for a generation of college students, you know, this was this $35 technique that you could learn. You practiced it twice a day for maybe 20 minutes. And it was sort of a simple, great, you know, sober alternative to pursuing, you know, sort of higher states of consciousness, which had really captured the imagination of that generation. Meanwhile, my mom, who left as soon as this started, my mom's name is Liz, and she grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and her father was an engineer, her mother was a nurse. And, you know, she came from a pretty like fractured family. There was a really ugly divorce. Her parents were drinking. There was, you know, some violence. And on top of that, the religion in their family was very restrictive. You know, it was all about sort of sinning. It was Roman Catholicism, and it was just about restrictions. And so this really kind of negative view of the human experience, for want of a better way of saying it. So my mom, you know, as soon as she could get out, she applied to college, and she went to University of Colorado Boulder, and she learned transcendental meditation there. And the second she learned it, it was just this life-changing experience. And she felt like it was the first time she felt like herself. You know, she transcended and really connected to that sense of quiet and silence. And, you know, after she learned TM, Maharishi came to Boulder. And it's always struck me that the story, my mom's story, which I'd always heard kind of growing up, like this love story, was so similar to Maharishi's story of seeing Gurudev, the same sense of kind of meeting eyes with this person and feeling overwhelmed by a sense of love and admiration and really wanting to just be around that person. So, you know, that really changed the course of my mom's life and subsequently my life. These are my parents. So my parents met at, my father's name is Fred, and they met at a TM retreat in Palm Springs in 1974. And, you know, my mom was this sort of, you know, really loved TM, very sweet, kind of innocent person, which I still find her to be today. And my dad was, you know, this kind of wild card, cosmopolitan, crazy guy who really, at that point, was at the TM retreat to kind of stop drinking and trying to kind of get away from his problems. But their lives intersected, and they got married less than a year later and had my brother. And, you know, that didn't work out that well. And I'll leave that for those of you who are going to read the book. But, you know, what ended up happening is my dad left. He was drinking all the time by the time I was 5. And, you know, my mom was kind of left without a sense of what she should do next. You know, he left us in New York City. That's where we were living at the time. And, you know, she really had this sense of longing and nostalgia for the community that she'd been a part of, the Transcendental Meditation movement, and that sense of belonging that she'd had when she was in college. So, meanwhile, in 1973, 1974, Maharishi had been sort of, you know, gathering this movement of college students and people, you know, teaching people to teach transcendental meditation. And he had a global vision for teaching the world transcendental meditation. And, you know, he printed elaborate brochures and pamphlets. I mean, I, in doing this book, spent a lot of time in the archives of the Maharishi University, and it's just, the output was incredible, and the ambition and the breadth of it. There's letters to congressmen in every state about, legislative changes that would help institute TM into the policy at like the state and federal level. And he bought this bankrupt university in Fairfield, Iowa, Parsons College. And Parsons, I don't know if anyone, I'm sure someone here is familiar with it, but was sort of known as, I think Time magazine or one of these big magazines called it Flunk Out University. And it was sort of this place that ended up with all the wild kids who ended up getting kicked out of all the other schools. So he buys this university, and the year that I was born, 1977, the movement kind of, in my opinion, takes a little bit of a turn. I wouldn't maybe call it a detour, but up until 1977, it's really this big popular movement. And in 1977, he introduces something called the TM City program. And this is an advanced meditation technique. It takes about a month or so to learn. And the early brochures promise you, sort of these incredible like superpowers. That's sort of what city means. And so the early brochures promised you like the strength of an elephant, the ability to walk through walls, and ultimately the ability to levitate. And this sort of changes the movement in many ways, to put it lightly. And the people who follow him down this road love it. The TM City technique is powerful, they enjoy it, but a lot of people kind of drop off. It starts to be seen as something more fringy because they're levitating. And Maharishi, on top of this, has this mathematical formula where he says that if, and I always get this backwards, but if 1% of the square root of the world's population practices the TM Seti technique, it will create world peace. And so instead of the Transcendental Meditation movement being about the individual and the change in their own lives through meditation, it becomes this larger kind of peace movement in some ways. It has a bigger kind of utopian vision. So he asks, in the late 70s for all of his followers to come to Iowa and go to the university and live in Fairfield and practice his TM City program together. And everybody's after this kind of magic number. Here we go. This is the science behind the TM City program. And that's what we did. So my family moved there in 1983. We were kind of in this crazy, chaotic moment in our lives. And sort of at that instant, my mom's friends from college said, hey, we're moving to Iowa to do this cool thing. You should move there. So we did. And this is, I figured to just kind of make it cohesive, the part I was going to read from my book takes place for this moment when everybody moves there. It was called the Taste of Utopia course. And this is in 1983. I was 6 years old, and the lead up, the course was in December, and the whole town is just transformed by this push to get 7,000 people there and to prepare for that, right? So the whole town is just caught up in this sort of excitement and building. And one of the things they build is the shed, which is a building big enough to have 7,000 people in it to meditate together. So I'm going to read this little part from my book and then finish up. So this is me standing outside the shed, and this is the first and only time that I saw Maharishi. Outside the shed, the line of people was boisterous, laughing in the darkness, their breath coming out in puffs of air that seemed to crystallize before vaporizing into the cold night. Above us, the stars felt especially close and bright. I was happily snuggled into my brand new periwinkle coat. Periwinkle was my favorite color. My mom said it matched my eyes, and the coat was entirely mine, soft and blue with a fuzzy dark blue trim. It was an early Christmas present, and I loved it. We were still broke, but my mom had scraped together the money. I thought periwinkle sounded like something a fairy would wear. The crowd shifted slowly forward, through the snow as badges were being checked at the door. Mom had hung hers around her neck over her coat. It said, "Town Super Radiance," in big gold letters above a picture of Mom, her hair shiny, a funny half smile on her face. Underneath it said, "Governor of the Age of Enlightenment, Siddha." Siddha, Mom had told me, meant supernatural powers. It meant you could levitate. Standing in a line in the snow, I pulled on Mom's hand and asked her what it felt like to fly. She started laughing in a way that kind of scared me, wild and loud. "It's the best thing in the world," she said, continuing to laugh in loose gales. I hadn't seen her in 2 weeks, not since she'd left for the flying course, and I just wanted to be near her. But out there with all those people, she felt far away from me, part of something else, and I didn't understand what she was laughing about. The women standing next to us started laughing too as my mom explained to them what I had asked. "There are no words for it, honey," my mom said. "It's just like out of this world." I blushed and decided to stop asking questions. Maharishi's name was on the tip of everyone's tongue. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the greatest man alive, our guru. Maharishi was coming. Maharishi was here. He would be here tonight at last. What would he say? Would he be proud of us, of the shed, of the 7,000 people, of Fairfield, the town that by the strength of his vision had been transformed into a meditating peace engine? At the entrance, a gray-haired lady scowled at us, her face framed by a big furry hat. Mom obediently pulled the laminated plastic badge from around her neck, and the lady gave it a long, stern glance, focusing her small pen flashlight on the photo of Mom, then looking up to examine her face. I felt an urgent knot of anxiety. What if we were turned away? But with a wave of her flashlight, she sent us forward. Inside, the shed felt like a huge aluminum castle, although it looked more like the side of an enormous indoor rodeo. Everyone's voices rippled off the metal, echoing through the vast space. We stopped at the entrance area where all around us people were crouching to take off their snow and mud-covered shoes. The sour, sweet smell of wet socks and shoes wafted through the air. Stacy and I pulled off our moon boots in a special spot we would remember, and then we followed Mom as she led the way past a golden rope and onto a sea of white sheeted slabs of foam. I immediately started to bounce, springing up and down. People had staked out spots for themselves with their blankets and pillows and canvas folding seats, as if they were at an indoor concert. We cut a path in between these encampments, looking for a place from which we would have a good view of Maharishi on stage. I felt nervous, like anything could happen. What if Maharishi looked out across the crowd and could see inside me? What if he saw something bad? Would he know that I often got distracted during meditation? That I spent a lot of time thinking about things I wanted? That sometimes I couldn't empty my mind? That I wasn't always peaceful? I also wondered if it would all happen that night the way that Maharishi had said it would, if all the wars would stop, if people would stop killing each other. I pictured a rain of food flying down from the sky. We found a spot near some other parents who had established a kid-friendly zone, and we dropped down among them. Mom put out 2 blankets she brought for us, and I sat next to Stacy, who was looking around for kids he knew. A big smile spread across his face as he took in the revelry, and everyone looked so happy. I looked ahead at the empty stage awash in blinding lights. Golden fabric was wrapped and draped all along the rim of the stage, and at the center stood an empty golden chair. It was surrounded by a wall of flowers, every kind of flower in the world, it seemed, and in every color of the rainbow. It looked like a waterfall cascading around this throne. Finally, a man in a buttery yellow suit walked onto the stage and stood in front of the microphone. "Jai Guru Dev," he said into it, his voice slow and firm. He held a large conch shell. As the microphone gave off a static noise, the man raised the shell to his lips and blew. The huge crowd of people fell silent as the strange tribal sound reverberated. People started to laugh, that same loose, wild laughter my mom and her friends had had outside, and again, I didn't know why. Suddenly, people were ringing bells, and then Mom was laughing too, and she too had a bell, a little brass bell that she withdrew from her pocket and rang along with everyone else. It didn't stop the laughing and the conch shell and the bells. It felt like it went on forever. I felt something inside me lift up, my heart racing, and then suddenly there was only silence. So that is that. So Maharishi came, as far as the official record goes, just that one time to Fairfield. That was the last time. He'd come a couple of times before, and then he never came back. And so what that meant, let's see. This is not moving. Maybe. Let's see if, there we go? Oh, these are the 7,000 people. So it was 1983-84. It was December and January. And it was just incredible. I mean, I know there's people in this room who were there for that, but it was just this phenomenal experience to be part of all these people with this sense of purpose that we were meditating and changing the world. And this is not going to keep working, so I'm going to do this. Here's some pictures of Yogic Flying. And, you know, the Yogic Flying was and still is in many ways a really important part of life in Fairfield. You know, people go for, you know, an hour or two in the morning or an hour or two in the evening, you know, so people can spend about 3 or 4, sometimes more hours a day meditating. And, you know, in those days, in the 80s, especially when there were so many people practicing together, you know, there'd be this, like, sort of traffic jam that happened. I mean, the other thing that's worth mentioning here is that it also, you know, this sort of huge surge of new people in Fairfield with these very different beliefs created a lot of tension in the community. And, you know, I think my understanding is that tension has gotten a lot better, but in the 1980s, it was pretty intense, you know. So at first, I went to a public school and, you know, was sort of immediately labeled as a guru, right? And the kids were townies. And so there's this real divide in the community between the gurus and the townies, and their kids. You know, I was in kindergarten, but there are kids who were getting beat up because their parents were flying. And I'm sure there were lots of townies who had a lot of questions about what were going on, and it was, you know, it was very secretive. People weren't, you know, if you didn't have a badge, you weren't allowed to go in. You could only get a badge if you had taken the course. So, you know, after the public school, I transferred to the Maharishi School of the Age of Enlightenment, which still exists today in Fairfield. I'm the blonde person with their eyes closed. And, you know, the school was just, you know, for me, a fantastic experience. You know, we meditated twice a day, and it was, you know, there's this real emphasis on life being blissful, so there's a lot of ease to it. It was very friendly. Difference was very much accepted. There were kids from all over the world who were there, and certainly all over the country. You know, there was a lot of songs. There more and more over time, there started to be more and more of an emphasis on sort of Maharishi's philosophy of living, which became increasingly Vedic, which is, you know, these ancient Indian sacred texts from thousands of years ago, which Maharishi, with his sort of enlightened authority, retranslated and revived this Vedic knowledge. And that became infused in every aspect of our education. So, you know, we were doing Vedic math, we were talking about Maharishi's science of creative intelligence, when we were also if we were learning science, we would talk about how Maharishi's principles of living could be seen in the science. So it really sort of became, for me, about Maharishi's knowledge. Here we are in the dome performing. This is me and my brother. So a lot of celebrations, you know, really feeling like a lot of celebrating Maharishi's achievements and a sense of purpose. You know, we had celebrations for everything. Here we go. There's another picture. That's not me. And this is, I think this is 4th grade. And we wore uniforms, and there was a real sense of trying to live according to Maharishi's ideals. There was the Ideal Student Award, which was highly coveted, never won by me, believe it or not. But, you know, it was a real, as I said, like the sense of purpose. You know, we would take leadership classes. We were preparing for the sort of dawn of the Age of Enlightenment when meditation changed the world, and we would be the leaders of that enlightened world. Yes, so this is sort of an example of the kind of charts and stuff that we would see around school, kind of mapping Maharishi's knowledge onto different ideas. Leave it at that. So then I'm going to move faster now. I become a teenager, I become grouchy, I become, as you see here, you know, start really sort of picking up on a lot of hypocrisy, as all teenagers do. But I looked around me, and what I felt like I was seeing was my mom, you know, who had moved us to this place with this sense of purpose and like a utopian vision, and also, you know, a desire to sort of relax and be stress-free. And yet, you know, the cost of going to the Dome, the cost of sending us to school, you know, the cost of buying Marishi's special medicines and herbs, she was just working all the time. At this point, we were living in Utopia Park, which is, you know, this meditator-only trailer park on the campus. And, you know, around this time, my father comes back, and I just start to really question and rebel. I'll leave you to read the book for more of that. In my opinion, you know, I felt like things got more and more orthodox in those years. This is the 90s. So this is a tower of invincibility, self-explanatory. But, you know, Maharishi started to have kind of ideas about, this is, you know, what I saw is that every aspect of life became prescribed, right? So it was the way that we built our houses, the way that we woke up in the morning, the way that we even took a shower, you know, the sort of Ayurvedic massage that you were supposed to do, the herbs you took, the way you acted, the language you used. And, you know, I mean, this is in the book, and I hope people see that, but I'm not putting all of this on Maharishi. Maharishi wasn't there, so it was the idea of Maharishi, right? So there's a lot of like trickle-down information that's coming into us and that people are responding to. And so, you know, you could say, is Maharishi controlling all of this? You know, he wasn't there. So it's just all of us responding to an idea of what Maharishi wanted. Moving faster now, I move away and go to college. And meanwhile, in my opinion, things get stranger and stranger. It feels more and more about a Vedic orthodoxy and this pursuit of this ideal sort of Vedic living. This is Tony Nader, who was a Lebanese physicist, a quantum physicist who, and I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, but mapped Maharishi's interpretation of Vedic literature onto the quantum field, and for that he was given his weight in gold and later crowned Raja Ram. He lives in Palm Beach today, I believe. Meanwhile, I have like a worldly life. I become a magazine writer. I'll move quickly through this. I moved to Los Angeles, and, you know, initially I'm not, I just feel like it's totally in my rearview mirror, all this experience. You know, I'm interested, I go home, I love Fairfield, but my sense is just that it's getting stranger and stranger. And there's, you know, rumors about big amounts of money missing and, you know, just sort of funky things happening with the movement, people fighting. And Maharishi passes away in 2008. Right around that time, in 2010, I have my first daughter, Josie, and I sort of experienced a change in my life and felt this real nostalgia and longing, surprisingly enough, for some of the things that I had grown up with that I had left behind. So even while I had this kind of negative vision of the TM movement, I felt sort of afraid of raising my kid without a lot of the ideas and values that I had grown up with. Not all the ideas and values, but some of them. And I felt, you know, kind of adrift, as I'm sure many new mothers do, and I certainly did. And so I made the decision to go back in 2011 and take the Yogic Flying course. I wasn't allowed to take it when I was a teenager. It cost thousands of dollars, and I was sort of like a bad kid. I skimmed over that part. But it's in the book. And I take the Yogic Flying course. And, you know, just move quickly. I had a great experience on it, demonstrated by this slide. Thank you. And, you know, I went back, I spent a month in Fairfield, and, you know, it was a real, you know, it was a really confusing experience for me, because on one hand, there was so much that I felt like was wrong and that I was frustrated with and that I had rebelled against that was still there. Things that bothered me, like seeing people working at the university who've been working there for decades and making little to no money. and, you know, these giant fundraising projects that still are going on for sort of abstract, in my opinion, ideas. And at the same time, you know, I'm meditating 7 hours a day and really enjoying it and loving it and getting a lot of value out of it. So you have to read the book to understand that slide. I'll just skim through that. And that is it. This is my family. And, you know, today my older daughter knows how to meditate, but I do not make her. And I meditate every day, but I don't practice the TM City program. And I'm still sort of in this process of kind of sorting things out, you know. And for me, part of writing this book was, there were a couple of ideas that I wanted to express, but one of them was this idea of, that I think is kind of a larger experience that many people have, of rejecting the religion of your childhood, and yet wanting to take things from it and missing pieces of it, and realizing that you can't just sort of be purely cynical about religions and communities that, while problematic, also provide all this value and experience and great things. So that's it. And I will just take questions if anyone has any. Yes.
Oh, hang on just a second.
Okay.
So if you can wait and I will hand you the mic.
Okay.
Okay, we'll find it.
I felt like when I was reading the book that you were enjoying your childhood and you loved the school, and yet I felt sorry for you, thinking your mother was neglecting you.
Oh.
Is that the way it was, or?
No, I'm pretty doted on. You know, I mean, I think you know, I've always felt extremely loved by my mother. You know, truly, I've felt like a really high priority in her life. Sometimes to an annoying degree, but. She's moved on to grandchildren now, so it's great. But you know, in terms of maybe what you're reacting to, because I've heard this before, it was a lot of time. Like, it did feel like a lot of time was taken up by this practice and by, you know, by paying for it or paying for life. And she was a struggling single mother. So I think, you know, anyone who has been a child of a single mother often ends up not getting as much quality time. But I didn't feel neglected. I think there was overall a sort of, especially later on as a teenager, you know, there is this kind of wildness that happened because, you know, everyone was gone for 3 or 4 hours a day meditating, and there was this kind of presumed innocence of children, which didn't exist, or didn't exist for many of them, including me. But, you know, I think the other piece of that, which taking this course myself shifted for me, was that my mom felt like she was doing the most important thing in the world. And that is like the tricky thing about belief. You know, it doesn't make sense to somebody who's outside of it, but when you're inside of it, you know, she was making the best choices for herself at that time for what she believed. I really think that. I think my dad neglected me. That's pretty clear. But, you know, my mom was there. She supported us.
Do we have other questions? Oh, come on. Come on. People want to know about Fairfield. Here.
Yeah, I can tell you anything.
I'm just curious about your mother's reaction to the book, her response to the book.
Yeah, it's a good question. I always get it. You know, I mean, it's not my mom's favorite book. I tried. She sees things differently. You know, I had her read it ahead of time, and she made many notes. You know, she'd feel terrible if she heard you ask that question. It would feel terrible for her, you know, because she feels like she she tried really hard. And I tried to get that on the page.
I felt that.
Okay.
She was trying hard.
Yeah.
But I wanted to.
You know, my mom lives in Fairfield still. She was just here, as I said. And she continues to meditate, and she continues to sometimes go to the Dome, and she's been free to do that. And I think, you know, the viewpoint that, and the, like, sort of evolution that I went through, many people in Fairfield have gone through. You know, I think I probably speak more from the majority perspective right now than some outcast, you know, debatable. But, you know, my mom has gone through her own process with it. I think she feels a much greater love for Maharishi than I feel. And I tried to represent that and give that its credence, even if I don't get it, and I don't feel it. But you know, I am aware that this is a person who had a huge impact on shaping my life, even if I never met him. But I have a lot more sort of questions about the choices he made, and I see a lot more contradiction in him. But she, you know, got to spend all this time with him and had all these powerful experiences, as did, you know, many people in her generation, you know, my friends' parents that were there. So it was just a really different experience for the kids, because it's like this total Wizard of Oz character, right? He's never there. He's, you know, his picture is everywhere in the room. When we, you know, have our birthday cake, we always give a slice over to his picture and Guru Dev. I mean, you can imagine what this is like for a kid. It's like, who's this guy? And every teacher says to you, you know, Maharishi says this and that. So, you know, I don't think she doesn't love that, and she felt, you know, you know, there's parts of it that she's embarrassed. I mean, I felt like it was a story that was really important to me to tell, and I tried my best to protect her in all the ways that I could and tell the parts I felt like were important and keep the other parts private as much as possible. And I still feel really protective of her and my family, so it's been a tricky act, but I don't know, it's still evolving. Yes?
I think this is a really important book. Don't think it is.
I can hear you.
Yes, I was a teacher.
Yeah.
But I know you're recording. I think it's a very important book. I haven't read it yet, but I really think it's important that people who have lived it tell it. I mean, we all have so many stories, and like you said, people want to know about the Maharishi in Fairfield and such. I had an opportunity as a, I don't say non-believer, but not as part of the community, to go and hear David Lynch and go into the Golden Dome. And I have to say, it's a pretty amazing experience just to go in as a outsider, I guess. I'm wondering about community, sense of community as you were growing up. And it looked like the children, the boys and girls, were educated in separate rooms, or?
Yeah.
And so did they, I don't want to make it sound like it was a cult, but did they try to speak to you differently as different genders, or am I just making that up?
They did. I'm going to separate those two things,
Okay.
because I have like kind of a strong opinion about one of those and
Sure.
less of a strong opinion about the other one. You know, as far as cult, like when I left when I was 17, I didn't have to sneak out in the dead of night. Like no one cared, you know, and that's like a, you know, in divinity school, when they talk about cults, it's like these like hard to escape from experiences. And Fairfields, it's like nobody cares. You know, just drive to the Cedar Rapids Airport. You know, I mean, that said, you know, it's a belief community, and there are sort of secretive parts of it. I mean, even the mantra itself is secretive, and I think that, you know, power and access to power and secrets does breed a certain something, you know. But you know, I never felt in danger, and I didn't feel in danger writing this book. I've gotten some mean letters, but so be it. As far as the gender thing, though, I didn't like that. And they do separate them by gender, and I do write about this in the book, so I think you should check it out, because it was something I was sort of, I don't want to say obsessed with, but, you know, I mean, my mom did, you know, I was watching, my mom was our primary, you know, household earner. She was an entirely empowered, fully you know, working woman. And the woman that we were told about, or the feminine ideals that we were taught at the Maharishi School, I found very limiting and irritating. And it's another example of, you know, when I described this sort of hamster wheel that I saw my mom on, you know, she would have these quotes from Maharishi in her room that were about femininity and gentleness and holding back behind and really just making the home. And it bothered me because, you know, I see my mom sort of balancing her checkbook and racing out and, like, you know, working and paying rent. And it was, to me, and there's many examples of this in my opinion, this way of this very foreign belief that was very much from a different culture that was being mapped onto a totally different world, you know, a different time and a different place. And there were, you know, there's friction there. So I don't have a problem with gender segregated education, but I did feel like the idea of gender was a sort of archaic one. I'm sure it's better today. Mo? Or, oh yeah, I have Nicole and this gentleman.
Do you have hope for world peace?
I have no hope. That's what this book is about. Do I have hope for world peace? You know, look, if every person in the world meditated 3 hours a day, probably it would be a really peaceful world, right? But I'm not sure that's like a mathematical proof. As far as world peace, like, I don't know what that would look like. I do believe that the wheel of progress is, I don't have an apocalyptic vision of the world, you know, and I do think it's important to invest in the world and make it better. So, you know, when I left as a teenager, I felt this frustration almost of, like, with the adults that were around me, that they sort of spent all their time meditating as a means to change the world. And I felt like, why not engage with the world? They seemed so disengaged to me. It felt like this very disengaged and sort of judgmental idea of the world, as opposed to kind of like going out there and interacting with people and helping them. So, you know, as a teenager, I really was irritated by that. But I would say now I'm hopeful-ish.
Claire, I know you studied religion. Was that your undergraduate or your graduate work?
It was graduate, yeah.
Graduate work. And your mother and I both share a Catholic childhood. And when I read your book, it was like reading my childhood, but set in a different place with a different group. And, you know, there were certain individuals who were abusing their power. And just kind of your study of religion, your master's work, have you ever thought about how that informs you looking back on your childhood and looking at other religions and the effect sort of super orthodoxy has on individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that. It is interesting because I feel like Mormons and Catholics are the people, besides the people who were from Fairfield, who've really connected with this book and seen a lot of similarities. And I see them. You know, I don't think I would have written this book if it felt like it was just this small truth. I feel like there is a bigger truth to it. And I think it is, you know, that I'm not sure how articulate I can be about it, but like that, you know, access to Maharishi was so limited, and his powers were so legend, you know, and revered, and he was kind of elevated in my experience as a kid as like a god among men, and you know, almost sort of a living god, and all the trappings that go into making that happen means, you know, that there ends up being an elite who do have access to him, and that access was usually through money. Sometimes it was through hard work, but it was often through money. And it meant that, you know, there were people who were on the far outside. You know, I mean, it felt like living in Utopia Park, we were kind of getting the trickle-down version of enlightenment. And so I do see a pattern there. I mean, I think you see it in churches, and not always, not always. I tend to be the defender of religion in conversations with people in Los Angeles. I usually am the one who points out all the wonderful parts of religion, but there is this thing that happens, and I find it so fascinating. I think for me, religion is sort of the most like love, in that it's like this powerful, transformative experience, and it involves this just sort of mind shift that happens for people, some kind of cosmic or divine transformation that happens, and often, the world totally lines up in order based on that, sort of cosmic sense or divine sense. And, at the same time, I find it like love, where you get these screwed up things that happen because the feelings are so passionate, so the dark and the light really comes into play. It's a generic answer, but that's what I think.
Here. Greg Brown has a song with a line about Fairfield. There's a lot of money in Fairfield, I'm going to get me some.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, whenever I visit Fairfield, it's a fascinating place. There's so much going on there, sustainability efforts and the arts and things. I'm curious what your thoughts are about how this influx of money and creativity and business sense that came along with the movement, but has sort of taken on a life of its own in the city,
Yeah.
has developed, and what its impact on the city of Fairfield has been.
I think it's a great point. I mean, Fairfield is always, there were always great people there. It was a really dynamic community, even when it got kind of strange. And there were always people asking questions. So I don't mean to make it sound like I was just like the lone teenager who was like, hey. I think a lot of people were asking questions all along, and really interesting questions. Fairfield now feels, it's so interesting to me because it feels like all of this happened, and then somehow that managed to preserve this like almost sweet ideal of a little Iowan town that is kind of hard to find. And I'm saying this to a bunch of Iowans, so I don't know, but it's like it's allowed this kind of smallness and sense of community to be preserved in this little sort of small town way of life that's really wonderful. And I don't think anyone would have guessed that, 40 years ago. So I think it's fantastic. I think, there's stuff going on at the university. There's conversations. The president of, I think, like 30 or 40 years just stepped down, and they have new leadership. And so I think there's a real hope there. I may not have hope for world peace, but I have hope that the university is kind of moving forward. And David Lynch has been a really powerful force for that. I mean, it's the most unlikely thing ever. I wasn't allowed to watch David Lynch movies when I was a kid because they weren't like blissful. And yet he has become this sort of evangelist for a new kind of TM. And as much as he is a total believer himself and utterly dedicated to Maharishi and his vision, he is introducing sort of more human kind of, or a more livable kind of way of life for people who practice TM. He's a guy who drinks and smokes and drinks coffee and wears black. He's just sort of outside of it all. And he's really returned to an emphasis on these like 20 minutes a day for as many people as possible, sort of the original vision, even some people would say, and leaving behind a lot of the Vedic, I know so many people in Los Angeles and New York who are learning meditation all the time, and they don't know anything about Vedic knowledge. They don't even know about Maharishi, and it's really because David Lynch has sort of streamlined it. And this is something, in terms of the religion question, that you see in these religious movements. If you have a sort of fringe, for want of a better term, a fringe movement in religious history, what happens with the first generation is they're these sort of really dedicated, true believers who totally have a complete adherence to a way of life. And what happens with the second generation, usually is this choice of either they die out, right? It just goes away because it doesn't get passed on, or it becomes somehow more streamlined or marketable, right? They take the strange things out for the second generation, and then it gets passed on and expanded. So you see it throughout American history where religions make a choice about sort of orthodoxy or like commercial viability, and you can see it in many churches. Yes. In speaking other places, usually the first question I get, besides my mom, is, do I think that Maharishi was a true spiritual teacher, or was he a con artist? Which one was he? And I feel like there's ambiguity there. And I'm sure that sounds terrible. I know that you probably don't like hearing con artist, but, and I don't quite mean it like that, but was he being manipulative? Of course he was a human being. And I think that was the problem, is that he was sort of portrayed as a person without human motivations, right? And so, as I said, he wasn't there in Fairfield. We were all responding to these ideas. And, I did all these interviews of people, and it was fascinating to me, the flow of knowledge of how things work. So, I tried to figure out how did we start learning Vedic math, because it was bananas and totally, it's the worst. And I can't even add now, so it's fine. But, how did that happen? And it's these stories of, people going to Maharishi and approaching him and saying, how can we make math more, spiritual, or whatever the question was. So they're asking him for it, and he's giving it to them. And so you could say, is it the question or the answer that's the problem there, right? So, maybe he wouldn't have given it if nobody had asked. But, there's certainly, I feel like, a sense, especially from people who knew Maharishi and who loved him, who feel like it wasn't his fault. It was that we kind of did that to him.
Our batteries have died.
So
Thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'm sure she will answer them.
I will. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.